Welcome. Thanks for joining us on the second day of Center for Genetics and Society's symposium, Genetic Justice from Start to Summit. I'm Katie Hassan, the Associate Director of CGS. I'm a woman in my 40s with curly red chin-length hair and pale skin with freckles. I'm wearing glasses and a teal V-neck sweater with a black and gray scarf. I would like to acknowledge that CGS sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. So we're thrilled to continue our symposium today, bringing social justice and human rights right to the heart of conversations about heritable human genome editing. Yesterday's panels included Marcy Jarnowski, with an explanation of how we got to where we are today, heading into the third International Summit on Human Genome Editing. Then we had Dorothy Roberts, George Annis, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Sylvia Yee, who explored opposition to heritable genome editing from the perspectives of human rights, disability rights, and racial and reproductive justice. So that is objection to the prospect that we might use gene editing tools like CRISPR to change the genes and the traits of future children and generations. And it's important to note again today, heritable genome editing is very different from the promising gene editing therapies that are being developed to treat existing patients with conditions like sickle cell disease. Somatic gene therapies raise some important concerns about whether they'll be developed and tested ethically, who will be able to access them given their sky-high costs, but they are much more widely supported than heritable genome editing. Concerns that genetic engineering of future children could undermine universal human rights and lead to a new eugenics, among other dire risks, led more than 70 countries to put policies in place prohibiting heritable genome editing. And this includes a legally binding international human rights treaty that has been ratified by 29 countries. It's called the Oviedo Convention. So while it's still the case that many scientists, civil society advocates, and much of the public continue to oppose heritable genome editing for its safety, ethical, and societal risks, there are some high-profile scientists and aligned bioethicists who are nonetheless eager to pursue it. And as we heard yesterday, those scientists happen to be very well placed at the forefront of the small elite circle that so far has dominated public conversations on heritable genome editing as organizers of the summit and other major committees and reports. So even though this group has been trying to back away from the early call for, quote, broad societal consensus that was called for before deciding whether heritable genome editing ever should be pursued, you really can't escape the call for broad public discussion, engagement, deliberation on this topic. It has been restated in every major report and by numerous influential bodies. So the question really becomes, what kind of public engagement will we have? It can't just be a matter of checking a box. It can't be a sidelined exercise that won't have any effect on policy. It needs to be global, needs to be broadly inclusive. It needs to be robust and meaningful with potential to actually influence decisions. To be all that, it will need time and it will need resources. And it needs to include and really prioritize participation of organized civil society. When you start from the perspectives of advocates engaged in on-the-ground efforts to achieve social change, completely different questions and ways of looking at the issue of heritable genome editing are going to emerge. And this is particularly true when those questions and perspectives emerge from exchanges among a diverse cross-section of civil society, not just one or two token voices. These kinds of cross-sector exchanges can be so fruitful I think we saw that here yesterday. I'm sure it will be the case today too. And this was one of our main goals in organizing the Missing Voices Initiative, including our MVI working group and the Gender Justice and Disability Rights Coalition. We wanted to foster these kinds of almost magical collaborations and discussions. We were also motivated to show that these, quote, missing voices are not actually missing at all. We wanted to amplify the essential voices and perspectives of this rich network of civil society advocates and scholars who are committed to social justice and human rights. And in doing so, to show how different conversations about heritable genome editing could be, and how limited the sort of official conversations have been by virtue of excluding these perspectives. As Marcy Darnovsky said in her remarks yesterday, quote, if social justice and human rights questions are put where they belong at the heart of the debate, it will be very clear that heritable genome editing has no place in the future we want to build. So heritable genome editing is not inevitable. There are more groups and broader coalitions than ever before working in opposition. We're going to feature these rich perspectives today and hear more about the coalitions that are building, and we'll do that in the panels that are coming up. So to start, I'd like to turn it over to Emily Galpern, who will moderate our first panel, Missing Voices Speak Out.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be here today at this wonderful event and with these incredible speakers. I'm Emily Galpern. I am a consultant with the Center for Genetics and Society. I am a pale-skinned woman with curly, chin-length brown hair and glasses and a light blue turtleneck. Our Missing Voices Speak Out panel is a really fantastic group of advocates and scholars who are focused on particular areas of social justice that we want to bring to you today about the debate around heritable genome editing. We're going to start off today with Larkin Taylor Parker. Larkin is an openly autistic attorney licensed in North Carolina and the legal director at Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I'm going to turn it over to Larkin.
Good afternoon. If, like me, you're in a time zone where it's afternoon. I am a relatively young, pale-skinned person with short brown hair, wearing a blue and green jacket. I'm coming to you from North Carolina, from the homeland of the Skarura people. And as you've been told, I work at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. This situates me working on behalf of a community that can expect to be hit hard by heritable genome editing, should this future we're also concerned about come to pass. Most people on this call, watching this webinar, attending this conference, are probably well aware of the history of eugenics that played out in many countries around the world, including my own. The area where I'm coming to you from was particularly aggressive in its program of sterilization. And this all happened less than 100 years ago. It wasn't long ago at all. Eugenics, as most of us know, inflicted a lot of horrific harms on marginalized people, from forced sterilization to institutionalization that broke up families and removed people from their communities. And this was all predicated on the idea that it would make society better. Of course, no one thinks of themselves as the villain. And the proponents of eugenics believed that certain kinds of people were the cause of social problems. Some kinds of human lives were objectively superior to others, and society would only ideally be made up of certain kinds of people. And that which kind any individual was pretty much set in stone at birth. Unfortunately, even after various revelations about the horrors that these ideas have brought about when taken to their logical conclusion in different parts of the world, they haven't gone away. We still have a tendency to act like we can engineer our way out of social problems instead of trying to resolve the conditions that create them. We still equate the causes of social problems to certain kinds of people. We still have a tendency that can be seen in moments as small as the hope that a baby will be born with 10 fingers and 10 toes. People's casual comments that they'd rather die than end up like that. That there is a view that certain kinds of human lives are inherently superior to others. This is still with us. And unfortunately, the conversations about what kinds of human existence are valid, are worth having, are worth keeping around, are still tending to take place among certain groups, very small, select groups of people, to the exclusion of the broader communities and often the people who are going to be most affected by efforts to change what kind of people there are, such as germline editing. Disabled people are one of the groups that would be hit hard by germline editing. Those of us whose disabilities have a genetic component. But we still too rarely get to be part of the discussion about what kinds of diversity are worth having and what kinds of lives are worth living. And this happens in a number of ways. It happens through academics and researchers who are making these decisions and who are creating the frameworks for what is ethical in what is viewed as ethical in these sorts of technologies, underemphasizing stakeholder inclusion in the first place. It happens through a lack of recognition that disabled people, not just the parents of disabled people, not just the caregivers, not just the professionals who work with us, but disabled people ourselves, have meaningful interests, have cultures and communities of our own, and might know what's best for our futures. It also happens through our difficulties gaining access to the kinds of formal professional roles that come with admission to conversations about the ethics of things like heritable genome editing through employment discrimination and discrimination in educational opportunities. This creates a dangerous situation where people who aren't really qualified by training or by life experience to evaluate the worth of human experiences very different from their own are deciding which ones are worthy. It's easy for all of us, I think, to overlook or misunderstand ways of life that are very different from our own. This is one of the things that makes diversity so important, particularly whenever big decisions are being made. It's good to have a variety of perspectives. And with our perspectives excluded, a lot of good information is being left out of the consideration of whether germline editing is something that should even be pursued. This creates a risk that heritable genome editing will eliminate some very worthy ways of life and will make humanity smaller, narrower, less diverse, and less interesting. It also risks treating the elimination of whole cultures and communities without their consent as aspirational, and stigmatizing people who are alive today as problems to be solved, instead of people who may have needs that we have to accommodate to allow everyone to be fully included in society. People who may need support in some ways, as all of us do.
Thank you so much, Larkin. It's great to hear you start us off here on these important places of hearing from perspectives that aren't heard and the people who are most affected. I'm going to turn it now to Narbese Flint. Narbese is a reproductive justice activist, and she serves as the Senior Director of Black Leadership and Engagement at Planned Parenthood Federation of America in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. Turn it over to Narbese.
Hello, thank you for having me. I am a brown-skinned African-American woman. I have a multicolored African print shirt on, long twist, and some very cute, I say, earrings, triangle gold earrings. And please also let me know if y'all are hearing me loud and clear. I am outside now. And then also just as a caveat, I'm not here in my day job at Planned Parenthood, but more as a reproductive justice activist. So just to follow up after Larkin, and thank you for that opening. I have been thinking a lot about how do I start this conversation that's so big in a small amount of time. So I'm going to refer to my notes, but I have 3 points that I want to talk about. First, I want to talk a little bit about myself. It is my North Star is Star Trek, and this is going to come back in a couple of seconds. But with that, I want to think and live in a world where we have figured out the basic needs of people and humanity, and that we are boldly going to see and people being able to realize their dreams. And it is where I think reproductive futurism, as Loretta calls it, and sci-fi reproductive justice intersect, which is where my church and my ministry is the idea of how science and humanity and the future can be the happy place. And then with that being said, I'm thinking about what does it mean for us to actually think about the future of reproduction, the future of reproductive justice that's inclusive for all of us. And so I thought of a story, because people remember things in stories. So I'm going to ask you all to imagine with me a story. So imagine that you're a teacher, and in your class, you're going to have to make a plant. You're going to grow a plant. It's a pineapple plant. And in your pineapple plant, in your class, you don't have really great soil, you don't have much access to water. It's not a lot of sunlight because of the school, and it's not like no windows. And so when you're growing this plant, it's not doing so well. And so another science teacher comes in and says, hey, yeah, I see your plant and it's not doing so well. We should make it better. So let's figure out how to make it better. And so you're like, okay. And you're like thinking, maybe we can get some better water in here or something. And they're like, no, we're going to change your plant. And how we're going to change your plant, we are going to make it so it never needs any water and it never needs any sunlight. And actually, let's make it glow in the dark. And so, like, you don't even need to see it. Like, you never even need any light. And you're like, well, I don't know about that. So what would that do for the future plants? And you're like, well, we don't really know what that does for future pineapple plants and like what does it do, but it's science, so you don't need to worry about that. And so you're like, okay, well, what does that do like for if other classes want to have the regular pineapple plants grow? And they're like, well, we actually don't know what that would do to the other pineapple plants in other classes, and nor should we care what they're doing. It's science, so we need you, this is going to be great. And so, like, well, all right. So we don't know what it's going to do in the future to other pineapple plants, and we don't know how it affects other folks in our school who are trying to grow plants either. All right, well, my last question here is, what happens if our conditions change? So what happens if all of a sudden we get a lot of sunlight, or like there's a whole bunch of water, and like, will the plant survive in that? And they're like, well, that's not something we can think about right now because this is our conditions of right now. And so it's science, needs not to think about that. So I use this kind of story to kind of illustrate the intersections where I feel like reproductive justice comes in. And not where we're thinking about a pineapple plant, but we're thinking about a human being, right? We're thinking about where we want to have a question about our conversation of like, well, can we have better conditions for people to survive and thrive? Like giving the water, making sure this has people have sunlight, right? Making sure that people are solving the isms. And we, instead of thinking about how we are creating the isms, are solving the isms, we are looking at making people harder. And so that is where I wanted to start our conversation. And I have 3 points that I wanted to get to. So one question, as we think about reproductive justice, and just also let me back up. When I think about reproductive justice, I want to make sure that we all have a framework for it. There's whole classes that can be taught around reproductive justice. But for today, when I think about, or when I talk about reproductive justice, this is everything that has to do with having a child, not having a child, and being able to raise your family and your children with dignity in a healthy, safe environment. This is a framework that was created by Black women using a human rights framework in the 90s. And so that's the quick version of reproductive justice. So using that framework, let's think about the first question, what comes up when we think about genome editing, which is what problem are we solving for? An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And are we using genome editing to make us better at normalizing inequities as a natural phenomenon instead of actually addressing the root isms and making people harder instead of the world softer? How are we addressing white supremacy, climate change, inequity, healthcare, capitalism, Or does genome editing cause the conditions for us to delay solving those isms while pushing humanity to be more closer to a perfectionism that is now centered around white bodies and their current understandings of quote unquote what is right and good? And instead of this, we don't open a debate to everybody, but only for a few people who are in the room, a few scientists that are dictating what are the constitutes as what's advancements. This is also in the caveat that we're not asking those scientists to be out there in the community to do the work and folks and think about ethics and morals and the long-term advancements of what this means. We are actually in the space of having folks and celebrating folks who don't actually think about these pieces and how the science actually can impact not only our world of right now, but our children's futures for a time and times come. Which goes back to the question that Larkin said and Dr. Benjamin asks is, who gets to decide whose lives are worth living? So the second piece and the second question I ask is, what are we losing? And this goes back to my Star Trek conversation. So I say this quite often, but I'm a big Star Trek person. And if you've watched TNG or The Next Generation, we have Geordi LaForge. He is, in this fictional world, is the person who is the chief engineer on the flagship Enterprise. He is gay, he is a Black man, and he is also blind. And he is badass, right? Solving things all the time. And in this world of genome editing, does Geordi get to exist? And does the diversity that he brings with being able to see things in different ways, right, from being born blind, get to still exist as well? The creativity, the thought, the ideas in this world, does that still exist for Geordi when we are creating the idea of what is good and right now and not giving space for people who have a variety of different ways and diversities of how they are currently a space to enter the conversation? I think this is particularly important when I think about the world in the future of Star Trek. It is a world that exists where we didn't change the people, we changed the environments to make sure that people were able to thrive in those environments. The last place and the last question that I want to throw up for our conversation is, do we create new forms of segregation with doing or thinking about genome editing? That people who have more money and more resources get to engineer their children to be faster, smarter, healthier, or whatever those things are in the world of now, right? While creating a literal different cast of people because of resources. And so this is a piece that, again, evolves in, or not evolves, but takes us out of thinking about how our current conditions of now and how we celebrate where we are now and what is right, and not think about how that if maybe we solve the issues that we have or that are impacting us now, that the ideas of what things are good might change. I will leave with, I will finish with this space because I know I'm reaching time, is that as we are talking about and thinking about us in Alabama, or where I'm at right now, in the civil rights movement place with a lot of history, and we think about where we were 50, 60, 70 years ago, or even a couple of 100 years ago, and thinking about where we are now in terms of what we think about and how we think about what is good and what our society is and what our ethics are and what our morals are. And imagine if we had created genome editing in the time where Black folks and people like myself were in bondage. And the idea of what is right and what is good, would I still be able to be having these conversations? And so with that, I know my time is up, but I just wanted to offer those questions as we think about how this intersects at the space of reproductive justice and the future of our species, that we have some important questions to be asking of ourselves and of our science community before we move forward and what can be our new future.
Thank you so much, Narbese. Thank you for bringing those great stories and analogies and your personal experience. Our next speaker is Dana Pearls, and Dana leads international and national regulatory and market campaigns on biotechnology and genetic engineering from a different perspective, not human biotechnologies, but plants and agriculture for the Food and Agriculture team at Friends of the Earth. I will turn it over to Dana.
Thanks so much. I am a white woman in my 40s. I have shoulder length, curly, reddish brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt with a black jacket. Narbese really cued me up well in the example about plants, and what if we could replace a natural plant with one that doesn't need water or sunlight. It's actually what we are seeing in the world of environmental genetically engineered organisms. So what we're seeing in this conversation is really a mirror of what we're seeing in the environmental and agriculture sector. We're seeing a new generation of genetic engineering technologies intended to artificially redesign life. Everything from algae and yeast cells to crops, insects, and as we're discussing, people. And so I want to ask and offer, what are the trends? What are the risks whose voices are represented? And are we addressing the real environmental and agricultural problems? We're seeing in the environmental space this attempt to fix with quick techno fixes for very complex problems. So there's a mismatch of how we're trying to address very complex climate change, biodiversity loss. We're seeing a deregulation trend at the federal and international levels. We're seeing government and corporate avoidance of public engagement. No public engagement required for new genetically engineered animals onto the market for human consumption. No assessment or public engagement about new genetically engineered crops to be released in agriculture, or even public engagement about mass releases of genetically engineered mosquitoes into communities in California or Florida. Some of these applications look like virus-resistant pigs, synthetic biology, soil microbes, herbicide-tolerant corn. Something akin to germline editing is a controversial technology intended to change an organism so that it always passes on genetically engineered traits, such as an auto-extinction trait in insects. And this would be passed on to all future generations of the organism until it changes the entire population forever. This is called a gene drive. We're hearing repeat promises, the same stories as the first round of genetic engineering, that we're going to feed the world, we're going to have drought-tolerant crops, pesticide-resistant insects and crops. But these technologies, rather than fixing the system, are focused on changing individual organisms to withstand the very problems we've created. So rather than fixing the soil contamination from pesticides, we design crops to be resistant to certain pesticides, rather than fixing factory farming and the problems we see within factory farming of animals. We try to change the animal to be virus resistant, heat tolerant, no beaks or horns. So there are a number of risks and concerns with almost no discussion with the general public or even frontline communities, despite these technologies permanently affecting all of us. We see irreversible contamination of ecosystems from genetically engineered crops, insects, genetically engineered pollen and trees. We see health problems, unknown and risky potential, detrimental health impacts on people, including from increased use of pesticides. We're seeing socioeconomic risks, including on farming communities, fishing communities, indigenous communities who are not at the table. We have ethical problems. Who gets to decide whether our world and nature is permanently engineered for all of us? And is this being decided by a small group of corporations that are unchecked by government or communities? The voices at the table represent big agribusiness, agrochemical companies, many of which are the very companies responsible for the problems that we're now trying to address. And this deregulation trend of our government agencies is highly problematic and continues to exclude the number of voices that can do risk assessments or name what's most appropriate for problems impacting communities. There's an incentive to rush new technologies to market, regardless of their ecological utility, ahead of appropriate and transparent assessment and oversight, ahead of full public engagement. These applications are protected by patent rights and confidential business information, making it nearly impossible for advocacy organizations, other scientists, the general public to understand the information that could permanently change nature, including agricultural systems, for all of us. And so, as we've heard, it's really crucial within the environmental space as well that we're evaluating these technologies at a multidisciplinary level, using the precautionary principle, looking at solutions that actually and truly address complex problems. And for that, we need all the voices at the table, including and especially the frontline communities most impacted. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dana. And thank you for bringing in another realm around environment and agriculture and food, and illustrating the parallels between biotechnologies that are related to humans and related to plants and the environment. The crossovers are so important. Our last speaker is Abril Saldaña, and Abril is a sociologist at the Universidad de Guanajuato in central Mexico. And she's currently exploring bioethical principles, practices, and regulations on human genome editing and stem cell research in Latin America. So I will turn it over to Abril.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Abril. I'm a Mexican woman in my 40s, almost 50s, with shin length, wavy brown hair, dark. I'm wearing glasses and a white blouse. So as Emily was saying, my concern regarding the future of human genome editing centers on the global divisions that are so often attached to decision-making in the context of controversial and high-stake technologies applied to human, and as Dana Pearl so rightly stated, non-human life. How countries of the global north and south are differently positioned and represented in the discussions. And when I say countries, I mean populations. And when I say populations, I mean the diversity of populations contained in nation states, especially in countries with histories of colonization. So one of the things that worry me the most is that acknowledging the needs and the complexity of public engagement is not enough to proceed with human genome editing or any other technology. We need to engage a diversity of voices, languages, that is very important, languages, and positions, and taken into consideration the hierarchies within the geographies of knowledge production. So histories and legacies of colonization still shape the way countries and communities are placed when it comes to taking decisions over the use of breakthrough technologies. The resources and institutions available to develop, to implement, and to monitor national and international regulations, but also, and most importantly, nations and populations are differently positioned when it comes to paying the price of global decisions when these decisions are taken without proper inclusive discussions and consultations. So how the colonial perspective will look like when it comes to human genome editing? Well, first, it will require including the voices of stakeholders, but also understanding that these are not homogenized, so they are not the same. When it comes to engaging civil society, indigenous people, disability groups, patients groups, or LGBT community, we must first understand that diverse histories, experiences, organizational capacities, and positions found within and across these communities along the North-South divide. So the voices of these groups must be heard in their own context, their own languages, and particular standpoints. So finally, when it comes to the global governance of human genome editing, we need to problematize the notion and the locus of governance. What I mean is that we need to zoom out the nation state by looking at what we call the circuits of use that allow or are allowing these technologies to happen or to be applied without appropriate regulation. And what I mean with circuits of use is a transnational movement of actors, such as physicians, scientists, of knowledge, the movement of tools, techniques, patients, and biological material within, but also across countries. The first baby born after mitochondrial transfer technique, or what they call three parents baby, happened in Mexico because according to the US doctor, head of the medical team from New York, Mexico was a country with no rules. So we need to make also the reprogenetic market accountable beyond national borders, watch closely to the increasing use of for-profit ethical review boards in the US and elsewhere. And we need appropriate regulations and measures to do so. So I'm going to stop here to give questions for time and discussions, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Abril. Thank you for bringing in the essential point about different perspectives related to geography and in particular global north and global south and the dominant voices of the global north. I'm going to, what we're going to do now is have an opportunity for the richness of all of the experiences and perspectives of our 4 speakers to come together and give you each a chance to respond to each other. So if there's something you'd like to comment on after hearing all of the speakers, in addition to your own remarks. I think we'll go in the same order we started with Larkin and then Norbese, Dana, and Abril. And you'll have a second chance to come back around, and then we'll see if there's some audience questions and comments that we want to address. So I'll turn it over to Larkin.
Thank you. I expected to learn a lot from this group, and I certainly have. I appreciate all of the other speakers today, but Norbese's pineapple plant analogy particularly resonated with me. I really question the wisdom of paring down human diversity at a moment when we face all kinds of unprecedented challenges. That risk often seems understated and underconsidered in discussions about heritable genome editing.
Thank you, Larkin. Norbese.
Yeah, I don't think I would have anything to add at the moment. I think other than that, well, okay, I guess this is something to add. Just this through line between plants, animals, and then us. I mean, humans are still animals, but and this piece and how that is not a huge leap between like what is happening with plants that Dana was talking about and what they were talking about what's happening with people, and that there is the same type of reasoning that is happening on why we are fixing our plants is why we are trying to fix people, but it's just not framed in the same type of framework. This is like, we're gonna help people, but wondering if we need to like really start being like, they're not trying to help people, they're trying to change people in the same way that they change plants, where you can just dump some pesticides on them and be like, yes, you will survive. That's the only thing not the only thing, but that was one of the pieces that I've been ruminating about.
Thanks, Norbese. And then we'll hear from Dana and Abril.
As you did before, Norbese, you really drew the connections between plants, insects, animals, and human engineering perfectly for me. I don't know if I can say it too much better, but I do want to say kind of to what Larkin and Norbese was saying is that there's a disconnect between the complex and really problematic situation that we're in the environment, trying to address contamination, the problems of factory farming, addressing drought and other issues caused by climate change. And there's a disconnect between the genetic engineering proposals and what's actually needed for very complex webs of life and ecosystems. This is not a machine, right? Ecosystems are not a machine where you can have a plug and play solution. And as Larkin was naming around the diversity of a population and this idea that we could, or like the attempt to pare down diversity, is what we're seeing in the environmental sector. That at a time of massive biodiversity loss of animals and plants and insects, we're seeing a push from genetic engineers to reduce that biodiversity to just a couple of different crops, a couple of different insects, the gene drive, which is designed to cause the extinction, permanent extinction of various organisms, including plants and animals and insects. And so at a time where we're already seen biodiversity loss, now there's a push to intentionally shrink biodiversity as well. And with these unassessed technologies, we may actually be perpetuating the very problems that we're trying to solve. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Abril?
Yes, well, I agree with Dana in that there are things happening without proper consultation, and I think that the way that these things are happening in the environment and plant and non-human world are a very good indicator of what's coming if we don't do something about it, if we don't ask for inclusion, and if we don't, and these things are happening already with some clinical trials, at least in Mexico, that we are seeing without any proper regulation to look over them. Again, in the case of the first baby born after a mitochondrial transfer technique that happened in Mexico, I think there was probably not enough condemnation around the world, and probably because it was a clinical trial in the hands of a US physician. He was not a Chinese physician. She was not a physician from the global south, but he was a US physician. So that's why probably the scientific community was not that appalled as it was with the case of the CRISPR babies. Because after all, as Baylis has argued, the MRT baby is a case of human modification. And we must be very concerned about what is happening with these technologies without any consultation, and look for what has already happened in the environment with plants and animals to see what is to come if we don't do something about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Abril. I am going to bring together a few themes from the panel and bring in a few questions from various places. I think some important things that I'm hearing that cross most of your talks is about the way that these technologies are very focused on technological fixes for social problems, as illustrated by Norbese's description of the pineapple plant, among things that each speaker said, and that instead of changing the environment and changing social conditions, changing economy and policy making, we are trying to change people, or that's the intent of this technology. And in the case of agriculture, plants and soil, etc. And that, as Abril brought in, there's a lack of regulation generally, and lack of corporate and government accountability and transparency. And really underlying all of that is the profit motive rather than centering people from these technologies. And lastly, the question of, well, it shouldn't be a question, but whose lives are valued, whose lives and what kind of lives and people are worth bringing into the world and living. And this is a question that has been, unfortunately, in our society for quite a long time, and has been brought to different communities about thinking that certain peoples and communities are less worthy than others, and people with certain traits are less worthy than others. And each speaker, I think, brought in so beautifully the importance of the diversity of experiences, of perspectives, of humans, and of the environment. And with the crucial moments that we are in with climate change, all the more evidence of how important it is that we value the humans we have on this earth and the earth on which we're living. So I think my question, you could address any of those things that I said, anyone on the panel, but I want to refer to something in the Q&A as well, which I think is related. Norbese brought up imagining futures, not just science fiction wise, which I know she loves, but imagining real futures. And what might that look like in this context that we are in right now? And the comment in the Q&A was, what is the binding force that could unite the resistance towards liberation. And I think particularly referring to some of the things that Abril had mentioned about different constructions, different understandings or visions by different peoples and different geographies. But to all of you, really, what is the future you could imagine, and how might we get there in a different route than through heritable genome editing? Abril, why don't you start us off?
Well, first, I think that the future that I'm imagining is to make a truly global consultation of the future of these technologies. One of the things that I'm worried about is this notion that some people in the global South are not pro-science. Because of religion, Catholicism, they're not really believers in science, and they won't go for it. And if you look, for instance, at international surveys about if people believe or not in science, you will see that that's not the case. I mean, if we look at, for instance, the number of people that were vaccinated during COVID, you could see that the global South, especially Latin America, was very, very interested in vaccination. So I think that there is so many prejudices about how people engage with science. And also, I think that these technologies, or the future that I'm imagining for these technologies, is one where science and scientists are accountable for what they do, and they really acknowledge the importance of trust in science. I think this is a moment where we need to really look into the stakes of not only of the technology itself, but in the relation that people have with science. So this is a very important moment for us to look at the future of society's relation with science. Thank you.
Thanks, Abril. Norbese, since you were talking about imagining futures, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think a couple of pieces. I mean, my nerdy self already talked about Star Trek, but I think the things that I would love to see as our future, or as we work on, is what does it mean for us to actually do a deep dive in root causes, and how do we start solving those pieces of what someone said is liberation, but like looking at racism, looking at patriarchy, looking at climate change, looking at all the pieces that are causing inequities in our societies, and then reevaluate our conversation of where science needs to go after we have that piece and after we do these things. I think sometimes we have a tendency of thinking that these issues are baked into our society and they're so big that we can't solve them, and not understanding that the systems and where we live right now are things that somebody created. So the structures that we sit in, how we run our society, are all of someone's imagination. And so that is important for us to have dreaming and imagination as strategy, and for us to think about what is our future, and that those things can also be created, and that it is not as, although it will be hard, it is not a possible task to move forward. And I think the last piece, after thinking about our future, and that is that we need to start also rethinking about science and the way we, I don't want to say teach it, but I guess that's the best word. And that we have a tendency of having this science is no good, no bad, it's just there, and how people use it is where the problem is. And being more sophisticated in our analysis of how we use science. Just the way that we want more kids to understand photosynthesis and have those tools available to them, I think it would be also important to make sure that our folks in STEM have the tools of social, not only social justice, but ethics and morals to be able to have and think about how their creations are being out in the world. Because even the simple question of what is important, what do we want to study, is based in what our current ideas of what is, again, good and right. So they are things that we might not be even thinking about because the people who are in the room are the ones getting to ask the questions that are based on their framework of what is their life and what is good.
Thanks, Narvese. Dana, since you're on screen, you want to comment and then we'll bring in Larkin?
Sure. I'm not sure I have too much to add, but in particular, the vision that we have for environmental and agricultural worlds is one that's ecological, one that's actually healthy for people and the planet, one that uses the known responsible technologies that are agroecological, that work with ecosystems, ones that have been used by Indigenous people for many generations. We know from data and international bodies that the best way and the most popular way, effective way to feed a growing planet is through food sovereignty, where people have control over their own farms, where they can tend to the land in ecological ways. And we have no data. In fact, we have opposite data to show that the genetic engineering technologies actually work against these goals. They result in corporate consolidation that put farmers out of business, that don't allow people to save their seeds, that contaminate farms, that cause genetically engineered salmon to potentially go extinct. And so the vision is that people can live in a world of food sovereignty, can save their seeds, can tend to the soil in a way that is healthy for that soil. And this is a world that does not use genetic engineering, that in turn is perpetuating the industrial impacts that we are stuck trying to address.
Thanks, Dana. Larkin, you have something to add?
I agree with the other panelists. I think that we need to remember that our social conditions are often made by human beings and can be changed by them, especially when we work collectively. We need to also have hope. The problems that we're facing can feel too big. That is very true. And technological change, technological development, and technological development that doesn't ask questions about, well, we can, but should we? Can feel inevitable sometimes, but our collective and individual actions actually do have a lot of power to shape the future. People who have struggled for liberation in the past have often made positive change, had some success in achieving their objectives, even if that success is limited and imperfect. And even at an individual level, on a very small scale, our actions can matter. I'm speaking to you today because in 1920s and 30s North Carolina, nobody called the eugenics board. People just kind of ignored this boy who was very conspicuously struggling with literacy. Eventually, he would be my grandfather. So the choices that we make together, individually, can actually get us closer to this world that is fit for humanity and nature, as opposed to trying to reshape those things to fit some of our very flawed social systems that we want.
Thank you, Larkin, so much. I want to turn to a little bit of a different angle, though completely related. And Larkin, maybe you can start us off on this because you talked about eugenics in your remarks at the beginning. And it's another area that overlaps all of the topics that each of you were talking about and really undergirds most of the interest in developing and using heritable genome editing. And because we have all of you advocates and some scholars around disability rights, reproductive justice, environmental justice, and global governance and colonialism, I think it's important to look at the history of how eugenics has affected each of the different communities or areas that you work with that we're talking about. And if you might want to talk about that in relation to the history that you know of from your work, as well as the connection to heritable genome editing and this question of the future, the just future, just and equitable future that we're all talking about, if you want to connect those as well. But I'll leave it up to you what entry point you have. But Larkin, if you want to start us off in relation to eugenics.
Yeah, eugenics is an issue of great concern to the community I serve. Worry about it, worry about what the future holds for us and whether there will be one, is something that has been around in the autistic community since I first started to get involved in discourse and a little activism in my mid-teens. And it's maybe a lower level worry as it has become less socially acceptable to talk about a world with no autistic people in it as a good thing, as the end goal, than it was 10 or 15 years ago, but it's still there and it probably always will be. Looking at what has happened to the number of children born with Down syndrome since the advent of prenatal testing in wealthy countries says a lot about the value placed on people with IDD. Now, parents don't make those choices in a vacuum. Prospective parents, they may be exposed to a lot of assumptions about the quality of life for people with IDD. They may know that service systems in a lot of places are wildly inadequate. There's no point in blaming the individual. Sorry, it's allergy season here. But at the same time, my community watches those developments and certainly sees how our lives are valued and whether some genetic marker is found that allows the same thing to happen to us in the future, whether the threat of heritable genome editing being used to attempt to eliminate autism is something that ever comes to pass. People who are alive right now, today, definitely see that and feel devalued. It's hard to feel like society is accepting you and welcoming you when it's still fairly politically correct to talk about the existence of people like you as a bad thing.
Thanks for sharing on such a personal level that applies so broadly societally, Larkin. Dana, did you want to respond to this question about eugenics?
I don't think that I have anything to add at this moment. Thank you.
Okay. Bring in Nurbeh, I'm sure has a lot of historical and contemporary knowledge about this issue too.
I mean, the only thing, I feel like Larkin got to most of the point. Yay. So thank you, but like, I think the other piece of, I think the two pieces that I would bring up is one of the reasons why the reproductive justice framework was created was this idea of eugenics, right? So why the second phase of, second wave of feminism was fighting for the right to not have children. Women of color, and particularly Black women, were fighting for the right to have children. And that's because of a long history in our country of who was valued as worthy and of who is able to have children, who is able to have families. And similar ideas of where, well, let me say, it is not too long ago whereby the simple act of being Black, that you were considered less than human. And in some places, but in some cases, and very oftentimes, that is still, like, we are still struggling with seeing the humanity of Black folks. And so if we are still struggling with just the simple fact of recognizing who humans are, and seeing their humanity, the idea is then like us judging or using the current understanding of who we are to set that in stone of who we should be is frightening and a nightmare for many of us, right? Because we are essentially locking in with science the current conditions of who is valuable. And the history, there is a through line with eugenics, right? And what science has done and what genome editing can offer if we are not vigilant in our conversation as a way to be more precise, to be more larger with ideas of orchestrating and bioengineering hate, bioengineering who's worthy, bioengineering value. And so I think that would be the only piece that I would add, is that although this is that we talk about it in a way that is like we need to be better in science, that this is also really a space that is very fearful for, and can be a lot of, or for me, causes a lot of fear that we could get essentially stuck in a future where I am not seen and my child is not seen as a full human being.
Thank you, Norbese, again, like Larkin, for your broader comments that you bring so personal, but illuminate the importance of the societal implications. Abril?
Yes, well, I was thinking about the clinical trials of the contraceptive pill developed by Gregory Pincus in the 1950s. The trial started in a psychiatric hospital in Boston. And then Pincus moved to Haiti, Puerto Rico, and Mexico. We have many of these stories that, regardless of the technology that we're looking at, they start to be, or the clinical trials often happen in places where there is no regulation, or the regulation cannot be effectively implemented. So I think that we need to learn from history, and we need to learn from history because some of these trials, or most of these trials, are justified by a discourse of eugenics. The Pincus trials were justified because women in these places, in these countries, were not protected by law, but they were also perceived as women that shouldn't reproduce. So I think that we need to be very careful and learn from history and not repeat the same mistakes.
Thanks, Abdil. We just have about 2 minutes left, and Abdil, since you're unmuted and just spoke also, I wanted to see if you could just talk maybe for 1 or 2 minutes about commercial interests and profit and conflict of interest in patents, because I know that's an area that you have focused on, and as we are hearing from all of you speakers, just about the profit motive versus centering people and humanity and justice.
Yes, well, one of the clinical trials that I'm looking at is the uterine lavage. It's a complicated technology to explain in 2 minutes, but it's something that is not regulated and that involve participants in Nayarit, Mexico, volunteers that were subjected to very intensive procedures that are, again, not under any regulation by law. And this clinical trial was designed by a company in the US, and the ethical board was a commercial ethical board in America. So things that are been happening or that had happened in Mexico have been overlooked by commercial or for-profit ethical review boards. So we need to look at how the reproductive and the reprogenetic market is developing, and how can we make accountable these markets and these companies, patents and interest, private clinics, for instance, that sort of promote themselves as very progressive, because one of the things that these technologies offer is a very frivolous or superficial image of a progressive technology that will give everyone the opportunity to reproduce as they wish. But we need to be careful with those discussions and make accountable not only countries, but also the market itself. So, yes.
Thank you, Abdil. That little teaser of a much bigger issue.
Yes.
Your scholarship is so important around this in so many areas here. And I just want to thank all of our panelists, Abdil, Dana, Nurbese, and Larkin, for superb remarks and interaction with each other, all that you bring from the history of your personal and professional experience and the communities that you're connected to. And it makes such a difference to have your voices that are very central here, but unfortunately missing from the larger international and national debates and policymaking. So thank you so much for your comments today. And I am going to turn it back to Katie, who will take us into the next panel.
Thank you. Just as we shift into the final panel, I'm going to play a little bit more from this video featuring important reasons to oppose heritable genome editing from people in our network. But we hope you will stay on. We're going to go through the end of the hour, and we have an exciting panel coming up next that's going to be forward-looking, talking about ways that you can get involved in the issue. The panel will be Genetic Justice Beyond the Summit. We'll start that in just a few seconds. Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone. We are coming into this next panel that will feature Isabel Bartram, Milton Reynolds, and Maria Nilatarta. This panel is Genetic Justice Beyond the Summit. And this is something that really should have been in the name of our symposium, Genetic Justice from Start to Summit, because of course, as we've been hearing, the upcoming summit isn't the beginning or the end of this conversation. And in this panel, we want to showcase some of the ongoing work and initiatives related to opposition to heritable genome editing and new initiatives that are getting off the ground. We hope to connect you with a range of ways to engage and activate on these issues. And I've spoken a little bit earlier today and yesterday about CGS's Missing Voices initiative. And it's part of our broader work at Center for Genetics and Society to bring together a range of academics and professionals across disciplines, as well as progressive advocacy organizations, including those focused on reproductive and disability rights and justice, racial justice, LGBTQ rights, Indigenous sovereignty, human rights, the environment. You've seen a taste of these over the past few days. And while few of these organizations focus primarily on gene editing or other genetic technologies, and therefore they are not often featured in the sort of international or mainstream conversations around heritable genome editing, they do see clearly how something like heritable genome editing would threaten hard-won rights and the cultures of disabled communities, as you've heard, or how existing sexism, racism, attempted erasure of Indigenous people might shape the development, the marketing, and the use of these technologies. So as these groups are committed to think deeply and work hard to bring a just and inclusive future into reality, they face a range of grave concerns about whether there's a place for this technology in the future that we aspire to. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. We will start with Isabel Bartram. Isabel is Program Director at Gen Ethos Network, a Berlin-based nonprofit organization advocating for the responsible use and governance of human genetics. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you. I'm Isabel Bartram. I'm usually in Berlin. I'm now joining you from a vacation in Switzerland. I'm a white woman, nearly 40 years old. I have dark blonde short hair and red glasses, and I'm wearing a gray sweater. You already introduced me. I'm a program director at Gen Ethisches Netzwerk or Gene Ethical Network. It is an NGO that was founded over 35 years ago by feminists and environmental activists and critical scientists to observe and report on biotechnological advances that impact society. In Germany, research on embryos is not allowed, and genetically modifying an embryo that is to be implanted is also forbidden. So, but some scientists use the hype and the enormous promises surrounding genome editing to lobby for a change of this law. So they say that Germany should be able to compete with the international research community. The law against embryo research is mostly based on the embryo as something sacred, as a potential human. I don't agree with this argument. And the argument of my organization is more that we fear that a market for eggs would be created, where poor women or other people would be quote unquote donate eggs for research with obscure benefit. Since genome editing was developed, we have warned about the entanglements of science and financial interests in this field that, in our opinion, make it so hard to assess the true risks and benefits of the technology. We are also very critical of the ableist discourse around heritable genome editing, where scientists and media talk about, quote unquote, healing every kind of disease and disability. We think scientific advances should serve a common public good, and heritable genome editing is not a goal that will benefit society. So we want an international stop on research in this direction. We released a statement on this topic in 2017 and an updated version in 2019 that we also translated to English. That is mostly focused on the medical field. As a representative of my organization, I'm also part of the Gender Justice and Disability Rights campaign against heritable genome editing that was initiated by the Center for Genetics and Society, and that is part of the Missing Voices initiative. This campaign is an action coalition of the UN Generation Equality Forum, and we are working together with scholars and other civil society organizations like the Pro-Choice Alliance for Responsible Research, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, the Genetic Support Foundation, the Sama Resource Group for Women and Health from India, and BioRespect from Switzerland. The goal of this coalition is to centralize gender justice and disability rights in public discussions and in policy making regarding heritable genome editing. So our objectives are to articulate a set of principles grounded in gender justice and disability rights to first inform civil society and public understanding, and then also the development of public policy related to heritable genome editing. And once we have established these principles, we will then develop model policies on heritable genome editing for countries and international bodies that don't already have policies on this topic. And also, we also want to create tools to assist organizations and scholars working in gender justice, disability rights, and other social justice fields to achieve inclusion of their voices and leadership in public discussions and regulatory deliberations on heritable genome editing. On top of this, Gene Ethical Network is also part of an international alliance of civil society organizations that will publish a declaration against heritable genome editing at the beginning of the summit in London. We are called the Coalition Stop Designer Babies, and the declaration, and it can be found and signed at coalitionstopdesignerbabies.net. The members are Stop Designer Babies UK, that is currently campaigning against the planned legalization of heritable genome editing in the UK. The Alliance for Humane Biotechnology from the US, and also the Center for Genetics and Society, and also BioRespect from Switzerland, and Sciences Citoyennes from France, and Gene Ethics Australia. Our main arguments are that designing children's genes runs counter to accepted basic visions of diversity, the inclusion and equality of all vulnerable individuals and minority groups, and allowing heritable genome editing would exacerbate existing social inequalities. And we also think it would be contrary to human dignity because it reduces human beings to the status of designed and optimized consumer objects. And we think it's not ethical to submit a child to the severe health risk of genetic modification just to preserve 100% biological relatedness. We are concerned about the, on top of that, we are concerned about the exploitation of and the health risk to those that are sourced for eggs for research to make heritable genome editing possible. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Isabel. Now we'll hear from Milton Reynolds. Milton is an educator and activist in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's the founder of Milton Reynolds Consulting, and he's on the advisory boards of the Center for Genetics and Society, the Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State University, and the Anti-Eugenics Project from Small Beginnings. Thanks, Milton.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks for the opportunity. So as you heard, my name is Milton Reynolds. I'm a middle-aged Black man with salt and pepper dreads that are waist length and a beard that's certainly more salt than pepper. And I'm coming to you from the unceded ancestral land of the Ohlone people. So I so appreciate the conversation that we're in. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively short so that we can actually get in some exchanges. But this conversation is resonating with me a great deal today. As recently as last Friday, I was in a conversation with the California Coalition for Eugenic Memorialization. And there were at least 3 women in that room who had been subject to sterilizations themselves. And so when we talk about eugenics as something of the past, I think we do ourselves a distinct disservice. We have to begin to think about eugenic as a present commitment, and in many cases, a sustained commitment to these notions of human improvement, but recognizing that this project of human improvement is one rooted in fallacies. Everybody is fine the way that they are, right? So we can start with that. But I mean, there's some things to be excited about, and I'm just going to list a few of them, and then hopefully we can delve a little bit more deeply. Is that there is a growing awareness of this history. When I go back to some of the work I was doing in terms of inviting educators into this history, up to 20 years ago, there was very little recognition of this history. And to the extent that it was recognized, it was typically associated with the Holocaust. That's actually a really important point of connection. It's actually a very critical history to understand. But it's also important to understand that it's part of a much larger history. And then when we begin to look at the impact and the scope and consequence of eugenic on a broader transnational level, what we understand is that all nations in which eugenics was implemented have a distinct and different trajectories of these ideas, but there are also some universal elements or things that are important to observe. One of the challenges, I think, of dealing with this history and then connecting the past to the present is the complexity of these issues. It's really layered. It's layered in ways that causes us to have to think about how do we disentangle these notions of categorical disposability from institutions that impose or assert differential value on people. But how do we also interrupt the habits of mind that invite us into essentialist thinking, that assert this notion that biology is destiny? Biology is not destiny, but those are seductive ideas. One of the reasons they're seductive is because they're simplistic. But the challenge of them is they're as dangerous as they are simplistic, because by virtue of causing us to look at the body as the site of deficiency, it prevents us from connecting the body or bodies into the larger context in which meaning is being assigned or imposed. And Dana and Larkin and so many people in yesterday's panel had made clear how dangerous those sort of narrow observations and that narrow focus is. When we begin to actually scope out and look at the broader impacts of eugenics, we can actually see that these patterns of normalized disposability are actually normalized. We can see through the COVID pandemic how particular communities bore disproportionate harms, right? And even the legacies of eugenics caused some people to be suspicious of scientific support and help. Recently, even in the NFL, there was an effort to do compensation for traumatic brain injuries. And we saw eugenic arguments being leveraged in order to advocate for lower compensation for African-American athletes who were already less intelligent. We see disability continue to be framed as pathology and something to be resolved rather than learning how to accommodate and to shift society. And there's my timer. I'm just gonna go just a minute or two more. And even in terms of resource allocations, we can see situations like Standing Rock and fights for water or Flint, when entire communities are seen as disposable and put in the crosshairs of change. So a couple ideas I'll just lift up really quickly. We need to challenge the framing of eugenics as purely historical and begin to utilize the historical thinking skills and frameworks such as change and continuity to follow the ways in which eugenics gets rebranded and normalized and the work that it does. In my own work, I've shifted a discourse away from race and identity to racialization and identification in order to speak to the ongoing preoccupation with assigning and imposing value. Inviting people into that kind of language invites them also to look more broadly and to look at the context and to ask different kinds of questions. And we also need to center the voices of those most marginalized. I think back on the work that's been done over the course of the past several years through From Small Beginnings, but also the work that Center for Genetics and Society has done for so many years. And centering the voice again of those most harmed, of those most marginalized. One of the culminations of the From Small Beginnings project was actually a week-long anti-centennial in which we centered the voices of BIPOC folks, people of colors, and specifically Indigenous and African-American voices. We centered queer voices and disabled, and the voices of the disabled. And what we came out with was a fundamentally different understanding. We also brought in artists and culture makers. And so those kinds of provocations and understandings of the history from that vantage point makes it clear that eugenics is alive and well. So how do we think about putting in place structures and systems to invite people into these conversations early and often so that they're not seduced by the ongoing efforts to market these projects of improvement as though we're all going to be consumers who have equal access, or that the ideas themselves are even worthy of exploring. So I look forward to chopping it up with the rest of you. Thanks for my time, and it's been a great conversation. Let's keep it rolling.
Thanks, Milton, for those comments. I'm excited to get into conversation as well to talk about some of these themes of challenging thinking and coalition building. First, we will hear from Maria Nylatarta, who's a legal researcher, policy advisor, and human rights advocate. Previously, Maria worked on the Real Productive Justice Project at the Center for Disability Law and Policy at the University of Galway. Thanks, Maria.
Hi everyone. I was listening to Milton and totally forgot that I was going to have to speak afterwards. To start, as a visual description, I am a very pale white woman with long dark hair. I'm wearing a pink jacket that I have found out doesn't have pockets, so I now hate it. And there is a wall and a bookcase behind me, as is now custom in Zoom calls. I'm going to talk a bit about coalition building and what it means to, or what's necessary to have inclusive movements, particularly within these spaces, and to make these conversations possible. I come from an academic and activist background. I've been, I suppose, an activist on disability rights for a long time, but also abortion rights and LGBT rights in Ireland. But I also work on a lot of these issues academically. So I'm generally always wearing two hats, or feel like neither an academic or an activist at any one time. I'm going to focus on just we need to build kind of a more inclusive movement around some of these things. And it's interesting, particularly existing in those in between spaces as a disabled person. A lot of the time you're in conversations where your value is called into question by people who have no understanding of your life. And I think sitting between the reproductive rights movement and the disability rights movement, which is where I'm going to draw the lessons I'm going to talk about today, it's quite interesting. It's an interesting space to be, but I'm also very grateful for the other disability rights activists who sit between those spaces. A lot of the time when we're talking about different things, we end up talking about things that are specifically harmful for disabled people, right? Like a lot of the time in the bioethics space, we talk very positively about the Oviedo Convention as something that's really, really useful, and we have done at different points in this call. The Oviedo Convention contains provisions that are directly contrary to disability rights with regards to consent. It's actually specifically contrary to the UNCRPD. And while disability activists were supportive of it initially because it was better than what had gone before, where you were allowed to override disabled people's consent without any participation, and Oviedo does allow for, or does mandate, that disabled people should participate in the decisions about them. It doesn't actually acknowledge that these decisions are disabled people's rights to make for themselves, which is particularly difficult when we apply that to the context of reproductive justice and reproductive rights, where disabled people are so often denied the rights to make their own decisions about their own reproductive lives. I'm going to talk about two things that are necessary, and two things that are necessary here. One, what the disability community needs in order to be able to participate effectively in some of these contested spaces and difficult discussions, and two, what wider communities need to do in order to ensure that disabled people can meaningfully participate within these spaces. And we talk a lot about, the importance of inclusion, but we sometimes ignore that for disabled people to participate fully in civil society, there has to be a disabled people's movement to participate. And that a lot of the time we're talking about these things in spaces where a disability rights movement has been unsupported or marginalized, or maybe doesn't exist in the fullest sense possible in the way that other human rights movements exist. And around the time of the referendum on abortion, even though Ireland has a history in disability rights, has a long history in disability rights, when we had our abortion referendum, there wasn't any feminist or groups that were engaged specifically on those issues, and they had to be created. So a lot of the time when we say we need to include disabled people, we actually need to see if there is a disabled community that is able to participate, and they need to be supported. Milton talked about eugenics being like a current issue, and over the last kind of 4 years or 7 years, we've seen several attempts to allow for further laws to allow for the involuntary sterilisation of disabled people. And in the Netherlands, where the disability movement might not necessarily be as strong or engaged in those issues, this law passed, and we now have further involuntary sterilisation of disabled people. Where in Indonesia, where you have a very, very strong feminist disability movement, this was the law that was introduced, which would have allowed for further sterilizations of disabled people, failed. That provision was removed because they were able to oppose it effectively. And disabled people need the space to actually be able to unpick, to be able to engage, need to be able to unpick and have these conversations themselves within their own movements. And that's something that's really important, because if you look at things like abortion or some of these other issues, they're particularly contested spaces for disabled people to exist in. Disabled people aren't a monolith. Disabled people have all sorts of other disabled people are rarely only disabled, right? Like people have other identities that might impact how they feel about these specific things. I recognize that took way more time than I thought it was, so I'm going to cut it short and look at what coalitions need to happen, because it's quite exciting to see the coalition that's happening around Missing Voices Initiative and Generation Equality, but also other coalitions that exist in these space where you see people working across movements. But it's not simply enough to say we want to include disabled people, or we want to include marginalized voices. There needs to be some mechanism to ensure that we're actually doing this effectively. And that's one, to just ensure that like access challenges are or that like access is met and is met without controversy or a fight. We're seeing a massive move right now towards moving back to in-person events without facilitating hybrid, and it's quite nice to be online without having to like argue that as an access need, although no one wants to bring me from New Zealand, to be fair. It's just way too far away. That like the actual buildings that we use, physical access, language interpretation, but also resources for people who are more marginalized within the disability community, right? Like easy to read is very rarely produced for these kind of events. And it would be great to see more, particularly given what Larkin said earlier, more inclusion of like people with IDD. We also need to go beyond tokenistic involvement. A lot of the time we look for like that acceptable person, right? And this is kind of true across groups, right? Look for that like acceptable, often tokenistic person who may not be connected with their community. And I think this is something that's really important, particularly when we like that representation alone is insufficient if someone isn't connected with that wider community and isn't necessarily representing the voices of that wider community. And I think this is where organizations of persons with disability and other like activist collectives need to be included, rather than just like single individual voices. The last thing I'm going to touch on, because I'm totally out of time, is that like non-disabled people also have to do the work. And this is something that's been really clear throughout the work I've done on reproductive justice and disability, where they might be like happy to like argue for what they already believe in terms of disability rights, that if you want to include disabled people within that broader movement, you also have to have some of those uncomfortable conversations with themselves. Larkin touched on this really well earlier when they talked about the different biases, that people have that they may not have ever interrogated before, and that just are a consequence of living in the world in which we live. But that actually, if that people who are aiming to include disability also have to have those uncomfortable conversations and like see where their biases are, and make sure that they do recognize the like equal dignity and like inherent worth of disabled people. So I'm totally out of time. Sorry, that ended up being a bit of a rushed job. Apologies.
Thanks so much, Maria. As we've done in the other panels, I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to respond to what they've heard from the other speakers. I think we have some really amazing themes here along the lines of, you know, how centering marginalized voices can really change the conversation, but also that it requires a certain level of challenging our thinking, and also that there's a lot of exciting work and also challenging work in coalition building. So I would love to hear from Isabel first, and then Milton, then Maria, and just, you know, perhaps 1 or 2 minutes of response. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say that Milton's remarks really resonated with me in the sense of what he said about that we need to change the framing of eugenics. It's not just a historical thing of the past, but that there are people today that were affected by eugenics and still are affected. And and then because often in debates on this topic, it's like seen as something that happened before, but now it's totally something completely else. And I often have this, when I talk about this subject in Germany, eugenics is very much talked about like something from the Third Reich, like that happened during World War II, and it is very hard to get it into conversations. When I mean, Milton is very right that there are like universal elements of these eugenic ideas that persist today very much, and to what Maria said, I found very interesting the point of how can disability communities be effectively included, and that it, this thing that there needs to be like a disability rights movement to connect to, and that and if it's not there, then you have to do the work of activating people. And we my organization did this successfully in regarding to non-invasive prenatal testing, but on this topic I found it hard because it's such a supposedly abstract topic to really get in a disability rights movement or organization involved, and to see this, that this is an important issue. And I want to get better on this. So this really spoke to me.
Thank you, Isabel. Milton?
Yeah, so sort of there was a question in the box asking about the shift of rhetoric away from sort of racism, and it's very intentional. It's actually, the purpose is to help people sort of think about the context in which these ideas are being generated. So sort of briefly, the challenge in the United States is racism in the post-war period is framed as an individual moral or ethical framing, rather than being able to understand systems and structures that assign differential value to people and normalize extractive ideologies and eliminationist ideologies. So for me, the shift in rhetoric is actually really important. It's important in terms of the work I do, because even the notion of this sort of individual sort of robs people of their agency. So when we talk about racialization and identification, we can also speak to how different communities have navigated that and the kinds of knowledge stores, skills, and competencies that are developed through these processes of navigation. And it's our shared understanding of each other's struggle histories and struggle knowledge that make us more powerful as a collective. And so organizing efforts have to be intersectional. We have to bring different people to the table, not because we want all the right faces in all the right places, but because there's deep stores of knowledge and strategy that's rooted in those different community struggle histories. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we do have to create mechanisms and structures that provide the resources for these sustained conversations so that we can build relational capital as well as intellectual capital together. And we're going to need it. These issues are coming down the pipe. They're actually here already. So how do we think together collectively and confront this juggernaut, which has never gone away in the first place? So I'll leave it at that and pass it over to Maria.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of on from that, thinking about like specific communities as well, that like when you're looking at like individual communities who are like, I suppose, to be represented, that when those communities build, that they themselves are intersectional. A lot of the time we have situations where you have what ends up being like a very privileged representation of a specific marginalized group, if that's possibly the right way to say that, right? You'll have organizations that will tend to be like of white wealthy people from a marginalized group, and I say this as a white financially stable person from a marginalized group, rather than a community that's like fully representative of the diversity of that entire community. And I think that really impacts things. A lot of these struggles are shared struggles, right? If we look at the sterilization thing, if we look at forced abortions or coerced abortions, if we look at like things from a justice perspective, these are all incredibly connected. And I think that's something we need to be mindful. And I really liked what Milton said there about like making sure it's not just the right place, faces at the table, but actually making sure everyone's really meaningfully there.
Thanks, Maria. There's a question from the Q&A about how coalition building between disabled activist groups and reproductive rights and justice could be strengthened. I wonder if you want to comment on that briefly.
Yeah, like it's a really, really hard one. I do think that like one, it is hard for disability rights organizations and disability movements to focus a lot on reproductive justice, because there's generally like they tend to be overstretched organizations. And I think what it takes, like, and if you're looking at, like, there isn't a single issue in the world that isn't a disability rights issue, right? Like, it's like, basically you can find a disability rights angle on pretty much everything, because disability is everywhere, right? No matter how hard they try, they won't actually eradicate us, because they'll probably create more of us. So it's really, but anyway, the point is that it's really hard for disability rights movements specifically to always be engaging. And what seems to need to happen in order for reproductive rights to do it, it seems to require a disability rights movement which is happy to constantly be effectively annoying themselves onto that table, right? Constantly putting up their hands, constantly being like, and and constantly raising their issues, sometimes in really uncomfortable spaces. And I think where you have disability rights organizations that do focus, like the one I'm from, that do focus a lot on reproductive justice issues, it's an uncomfortable space for people to have to work in. I've seen a few examples of people from the reproductive rights movement who've truly, really engaged and done the work on disability while being non-disabled. I have yet to figure out a way to get the broader reproductive rights movement to really do that work, and I'm not necessarily sure we're there yet. I think the pressure to, like, feel like you're saying the right thing or to have all the right faces on the table actually sometimes does help in this, but it is not sufficient to actually get people to do the work. And I think we're going to struggle with that. So yeah, basically more feminist, reproductive rights focused disabled people, but that's the only thing I found that's worked.
Thanks, Maria. So unfortunately, we've hit the end of our discussion time already, and I'm sorry to say that. I want to thank this panel, especially Isabel, Milton, and Maria, for this great forward-looking discussion that also helps people watching today find ways to engage on these issues and to see some promising paths forward, as well as challenges that will come up along the way. But we hope that those of you watching today will join in. Just to recap some of the specifically international summit focused events that are coming up at the coalitions that are ongoing and getting off the ground now. We heard about an international declaration against legalization of heritable genetic modification that's open for signatures. There are also several other upcoming events that you can participate in next weekend. There's an in-person Heritable Genome Editing and Equality Conference if you'll be in London. And the group Stop Designer Babies is organizing a hybrid teach-in also this weekend. We're putting some links about these events in the chat for you. Next Tuesday evening, the Global Observatory on Genome Editing is hosting another hybrid convening. And if you don't catch it in the chat, all of that information is available on the information page for this symposium. And that is also where you'll find the video and transcript of this symposium when it goes up later this week. We hope also, in addition to participating in these events, I mean, this is something that we at CGS are so excited about, to see this convergence of multiple events coming from groups with multiple perspectives converging around the summit. This hasn't happened before, and we hope that you will jump in and add to this momentum and let that carry you over into taking the perspectives, the challenging questions that you've encountered in our event and these others with you to participate virtually or in person at the International Summit next week, March 6th through 8th. Registration for online participation in that is still open. You can also follow CGS on our social media channels, where we'll be keeping you up to date on what's going on during these events. And finally, I just want to let you know about a third webinar in our Missing Voices series coming up on March 28th. This will be Feminist Intersections, Heritable Genome Editing at a Crossroads. Registration for that is open. And just as we close, I want to thank our fantastic roster of speakers today, as well as yesterday. I want to give special thanks to our CGS crew, especially Emma McDonald, who's been getting the word out about this event and keeping the Zoom tech running smoothly behind the scenes. And also to Emily Galpern for her work in organizing as well as moderating today. Thank you to our ASL interpreters and our captioners. And thank you to all of you for watching, for commenting, connecting, engaging, submitting questions. We think you've really made this a great event. We hope you'll all keep in touch and keep these conversations going. Thanks so much. Goodbye.